The alarm goes off. You hit snooze, roll over, check your phone, scroll through social media for a few minutes before dragging yourself out of bed. Another ordinary morning in a world of 8 billion people, cities sprawling across every continent, humans everywhere you look. We're the dominant species on Earth, and it feels like we've always been this way, like there's always been billions of us crowding the planet, building civilizations, reshaping entire landscapes. But here's something that'll absolutely shatter that comfortable assumption. There was a moment in our history when we almost didn't make it, a point where the entire future of humanity hung by the thinnest possible thread. We're not talking about millions of humans barely surviving some catastrophe. We're talking about maybe 2,000 people. 2,000, that's it. The entire breeding population of Homo sapiens reduced to a number that would barely fill a small college campus. If you're using these to fall asleep, that's literally why I make them, so subscribe maybe. Tell me where you are and what time. I check comments, and it's like Berlin at breakfast, Boston at bedtime, all at once. Think about that for a second. 2,000 people. If you've ever been to a mid-sized concert, you've seen more people than that. If you've ever walked through Times Square on New Year's Eve, you've been surrounded by dozens of times that number. But at one point in our species' history, that was everyone. That was the entire genetic reservoir from which all 8 billion humans alive today would eventually emerge. And this wasn't ancient history in the sense of pre-human ancestors or some distant evolutionary branch. This happened to us, to Homo sapiens, to anatomically modern humans who looked exactly like we do, who had brains exactly like ours, who could have fit seamlessly into modern society if you gave them a shower, some clothes, and a few years to catch up on current events. The story of how we know this, how scientists pieced together this near extinction event from the tiniest clues hidden in our DNA, is absolutely fascinating. But the story of how those 2,000 people survived, how they managed to keep humanity alive when everything was stacked against them, that's even more incredible. We're going to trace this entire journey from the climate catastrophe that nearly ended our species, to the genetic detective work that uncovered what happened, to the profound implications this has for understanding who we are and where we came from. Because once you understand how close we came to not existing at all, you see humanity in a completely different light. It starts in Africa, around 70,000 years ago. The world is in the grip of the last ice age. But this isn't just cold weather and a few glaciers. This is a planetary deep freeze that has transformed Earth into something barely recognizable. Massive ice sheets cover Canada, Northern Europe, and significant portions of Asia. These aren't just frozen rivers or snow-covered mountains. These are ice structures kilometers thick, so massive they're literally pushing the Earth's crust down under their weight. But the ice isn't the real problem for early humans in Africa. The real problem is what the ice does to the climate everywhere else. See, when you lock up that much water in ice sheets, it changes everything. Sea levels drop by 120 meters. That's enough to expose entire continental shelves, create land bridges between continents, and completely reshape coastlines. The Mediterranean becomes a series of smaller seas. The English Channel doesn't exist. You could walk from Russia to Alaska, but in Africa, where most humans are living, the effect is even more dramatic. The climate becomes drastically drier, rainfall patterns shift, rivers that have flowed for millions of years suddenly run dry. Lakes that sustained entire ecosystems evaporate into salt flats. The forests, the lush tropical environments where early humans thrived, they start to shrink. Year by year, decade by decade, the green zones contract while the deserts expand. Archaeological evidence paints a grim picture of this period. Sites that were once thriving human settlements are abandoned. The density of tools and artifacts which archaeologists use to estimate population sizes drops dramatically. It's not that humans moved somewhere else. There wasn't anywhere else to go. They were dying. But then something happened that made everything infinitely worse. Around 74,000 years ago, Mount Toba in Indonesia exploded in what geologists call a super eruption. This wasn't a normal volcanic event. This was one of the largest volcanic eruptions in the last 2 million years. To put it in perspective, Mount St. Helens in 1980 ejected about 1 cubic kilometre of material. Toba ejected about 2,800 cubic kilometres. The explosion was so massive it was heard across the Indian Ocean. Ash fell as far as India, creating deposits that are still visible in soil cores today, but the real devastation came from what got pumped into the atmosphere. Sulfur dioxide, ash particles, volcanic gases. All of this shot up into the stratosphere where it spread across the entire planet. Within weeks, the sky darkened everywhere on Earth. Temperatures plummeted. The volcanic winter had begun. And this wasn't just a bad year or two. Geological evidence suggests that global temperatures dropped by several degrees Celsius and stayed depressed for potentially a decade or more. In some regions, temperatures might have dropped by as much as 15 degrees. For early human populations already struggling with drought and resource scarcity, this was catastrophic. Imagine you're part of a small group barely surviving on the edge of habitability. Your water sources are unreliable, game is scarce, plant foods are harder to find every year. You've already lost friends and family members to starvation and disease. Then suddenly the sun disappears behind a haze of volcanic ash. Temperatures drop. What little vegetation remained dies off. The animals either migrate away or starve. This is the volcanic winter that nearly ended humanity. And we almost didn't make it through. For over a century, scientists have known that something unusual happened in human evolutionary history. The clue was hidden in plain sight, in the genetic diversity of modern human populations, or rather, in the lack of it. Here's the thing that puzzled geneticists for decades. When you compare genetic diversity across different species, humans are weirdly uniform. Take chimpanzees, our closest living relatives. There are maybe 300,000 chimps left in the wild, scattered across equatorial Africa. When you sequence their DNA, you find enormous genetic variation between different populations. Chimps from West Africa are more genetically different from chimps in East Africa than any two humans anywhere on Earth are from each other. Think about that. Two chimps from different parts of Africa are more different from each other than a Norwegian is from an Aboriginal Australian, more different than a Japanese person is from a Peruvian. More different than any two humans you could possibly find, no matter how geographically separated they are. This pattern shows up everywhere you look in human genetics. We have less genetic diversity than chimps, despite having a much larger population spread across the entire planet. We have less genetic diversity than gorillas, despite them being critically endangered. We even have less genetic diversity than many species that went through known population bottlenecks. A population bottleneck is exactly what it sounds like. It's when a species gets squeezed through a very tight constraint, when population numbers drop so low that most of the genetic variation in the species is lost. The individuals that survive become the ancestors of all future generations, but because there are so few of them, they carry only a fraction of the total genetic diversity that existed before the bottleneck. It's like if you had a jar full of different coloured marbles, thousands of them in every colour imaginable, then you randomly picked out 20 marbles and threw all the rest away. Those 20 marbles would now determine what colours are available going forward. Rare colours would likely disappear completely. Common colours would dominate. The total diversity would be drastically reduced. That's what happened to humans. And geneticists could see the evidence of it in our DNA, but they couldn't figure out when it happened or how severe it was. The genetic techniques available in the mid-20th century could tell them that something had occurred, but they couldn't pinpoint the details. Everything changed with the development of modern genetic sequencing technology. In the 1980s and 90s, scientists began to develop techniques that could read DNA sequences with unprecedented accuracy and detail. They started sequencing mitochondrial DNA, which is passed down exclusively through the maternal line, then Y chromosome DNA, which is passed down through the paternal line, then eventually entire nuclear genomes. And what they found was shocking. When you trace human mitochondrial DNA back through time, all lineages converge on a single woman who lived in Africa between 150,000 and 200,000 years ago. Scientists call her mitochondrial Eve, though that's a bit misleading. She wasn't the only woman alive at the time, she was just the only woman from that time period who has an unbroken line of daughters leading to people alive today. The Y chromosome tells a similar story. All human Y chromosomes trace back to a single man who lived in Africa somewhere between 200,000 and 300,000 years ago. Again, not the only man alive, just the only one with an unbroken line of sons to the present day. But the really interesting data came from studying the entire genome. In the early 2000s, as sequencing technology improved and became cheaper, scientists began sequencing complete human genomes from people all around the world. They could now look at millions of genetic markers and trace human population history with incredible precision. And that's when they found the bottleneck. Multiple independent studies using different methodologies all pointed to the same conclusion. Somewhere between 50,000 and 100,000 years ago, the human population crashed to incredibly low numbers. The estimates varied depending on the study and the assumptions used, but they all painted the same basic picture. A severe, prolonged population bottleneck that reduced humanity to a tiny remnant of what it had been before. One of the most detailed studies was published in 2008 by researchers analysing microsatellite markers across the human genome. These are highly variable regions of DNA that mutate quickly, making them perfect for tracking recent population history. The team analysed data from 938 individuals from 51 populations around the world. Their conclusion was startling. The effective population size of humans during the bottleneck might have been as low as 2,000 individuals. The effective population size is a genetics term that's a bit different from the actual number of people alive. It roughly corresponds to the number of individuals successfully contributing genes to the next generation. The actual population could have been somewhat larger, maybe 10,000 or 15,000 total people, but only about 2,000 of them were having children who survived to reproduce themselves. To put this in perspective, the World Health Organization considers a species critically endangered when its population drops below 2,500 individuals. We were below that threshold. Humanity was critically endangered. One bad drought, one epidemic disease, one conflict with a neighboring group, and we could have gone extinct. And this bottleneck didn't last for just a few years. The genetic evidence suggests it persisted for thousands of years, possibly as long as 10,000 to 20,000 years. That's not a momentary crisis. That's multiple generations of humans living on the absolute edge of survival, never quite recovering to sustainable population levels, always one disaster away from extinction. Other studies using different genetic markers confirmed these findings. A 2009 analysis of single nucleotide polymorphisms, SNPs, tiny variations in individual DNA letters, found evidence of extreme population reduction beginning around 70,000 years ago. The timing matched perfectly with the Toba eruption. A 2010 study looking at copy number variations where segments of DNA are deleted or duplicated found the same pattern. Severe bottleneck beginning around 70,000 years ago, lasting for tens of thousands of years. The evidence kept piling up from every direction. Mitochondrial DNA, Y chromosome DNA, nuclear genome data, microsatellites, SNPs, copy number variations. Every type of genetic marker told the same story. Humans went through a catastrophic population crash that nearly ended our species. But genetic data can only tell you that something happened. It can tell you when and roughly how severe it was, but it can't tell you why. To understand the why, you need to look at other evidence, climate data, archaeological evidence, geological records. And when scientists started putting all of this together, a picture emerged of what might be the most harrowing survival story in human history. The climate data comes from ice cores, long cylinders of ice drilled out of glaciers in Greenland and Antarctica. These ice cores contain trapped air bubbles that preserve samples of ancient atmosphere. By analyzing the chemical composition of these bubbles, scientists can reconstruct past temperatures, precipitation patterns, and atmospheric composition going back hundreds of thousands of years. The ice cores from this period tell a story of dramatic climate instability. The Earth was already in an ice age, but around 70,000 years ago, things got worse, much worse. This period, known to climate scientists as marine isotope stage 4, was one of the coldest and driest intervals of the entire ice age. But the ice cores also reveal something else. Around 74,000 years ago, there's a spike in sulfur dioxide levels trapped in the ice. This spike corresponds exactly with the Toba supereruption. The volcanic gases from Toba made it all the way to the poles and got locked into the ice sheets, creating a permanent record of the catastrophe. The geological evidence from around the world confirms the impact. Volcanic ash from Toba has been found in sediment cores from the Indian Ocean, the Bay of Bengal, the Arabian Sea, and even as far away as the South China Sea. The ash layer is sometimes several meters thick, indicating truly massive ashfall. In India, the ash deposits are so thick and so widespread that they've been used for decades as a dating layer, a geological marker that allows archaeologists to determine whether sites are older or younger than the Toba eruption. Sites below the ash layer are pre-Toba. Sites above the ash layer are post-Toba. And here's where it gets interesting for human history. There are significantly fewer archaeological sites above the ash layer than below it. In Southeast Asia, the pattern is even more dramatic. Several sites show continuous human occupation for thousands of years, then complete abandonment right around the time of the Toba eruption. These aren't temporary evacuations where people come back after the danger passes. These are permanent abandonments. The sites remain empty for thousands of years. Archaeological evidence from Africa tells a similar story. Sites that were continuously occupied for tens of thousands of years show a marked decrease in human activity right around 70,000 years ago. Tool densities drop, the variety of tool types decreases. Ochre processing, which was a major activity at many sites, becomes less common or disappears entirely. Some researchers have argued that the archaeological evidence shows a clear pattern of population decline across Africa, not just in one region, but continent-wide. The number of sites occupied simultaneously decreases. The geographic range of human occupation appears to contract. Signs of long-distance trade networks, which had been developing in Africa for tens of thousands of years, become less evident. But probably the most compelling evidence comes from evolutionary genetics, combined with paleoclimate modeling. Scientists have developed sophisticated computer models that can simulate how ancient populations would have responded to different climate scenarios. These models incorporate data about resource availability, climate conditions, human reproductive rates, and survival probabilities. When researchers ran simulations using climate data from the period around 70,000 years ago, they found that only very small populations in very specific refugia, areas with relatively stable climate and reliable resources, would have had a reasonable chance of survival. Most of Africa, which had been habitable for humans for hundreds of thousands of years, would have become essentially uninhabitable during the worst periods. The models suggest that humans might have survived in isolated pockets, small populations, in areas that retained enough rainfall and vegetation to support human life, possibly along coastlines where marine resources provided alternative food sources, possibly in highland areas where different climate patterns prevailed, possibly in the interior of southern Africa, where some regions seem to maintain more stable conditions. These refugia, these survival pockets, would have been separated by vast expanses of newly inhospitable territory, deserts where there had been woodland, dry grassland where there had been forests. The human populations would have been fragmented, isolated from each other, each group struggling to survive on whatever resources their particular refugium could provide. And this isolation would have made the situation even more dangerous. When populations are fragmented, they can't help each other. They can't share resources during local shortages. They can't exchange individuals to maintain genetic diversity. Each isolated group faces the full force of environmental challenges alone. Genetic drift, random changes in gene frequencies that happen in small populations, becomes a major factor. Beneficial genetic variants can be lost by chance. Harmful variants can increase in frequency. Inbreeding becomes inevitable, which increases the risk of genetic disorders and reduces overall fitness. The bottleneck wasn't just about low numbers. It was about small, isolated populations struggling separately, each one vulnerable to extinction, each one carrying only a small fraction of humanity's total genetic diversity. If any one of these groups had failed, we would have lost whatever unique genetic variants they carried, narrowing humanity's genetic base even further. But somehow, they didn't all fail. Somehow, enough of these small populations survived long enough for conditions to eventually improve. Somehow, they made it through the worst of the climate crisis and the volcanic winter, maintained enough genetic diversity to avoid inbreeding depression, and eventually reconnected with other surviving groups to rebuild human population numbers. The question that haunts every researcher who studies this period is simple. How? How did they do it? What survival strategies allowed these small groups of early humans to endure conditions that were killing almost everything around them? What knowledge, what technologies, what social systems kept them alive when extinction seemed inevitable? To answer that, we need to understand who these people were, what they were capable of, and how their ancestors had prepared them for this ultimate test. The humans who lived through the bottleneck weren't primitive cave dwellers barely able to survive. By 70,000 years ago, Homo sapiens had already been evolving for at least 200,000 years. They had big brains, sophisticated language, complex social structures, and advanced technologies that their ancestors had been refining for hundreds of thousands of years. Let's start with their brains. Modern human brains average about 1,350 cubic centimeters in volume. The humans living 70,000 years ago had brains just as large, possibly even slightly larger on average. But size alone doesn't tell the whole story. The shape and internal structure of their brains were also modern. They had fully developed frontal lobes for planning and abstract thought, sophisticated language centers, and neural architecture capable of the full range of human cognition. We know this from studying skulls from this period, but we also know it from their artifacts. The tools they made required complex planning and abstract thinking. The art they created required symbolic reasoning and aesthetic sensibility. The distances they traveled required navigation skills and geographic knowledge. Everything about their material culture demonstrates that they were cognitively modern humans, just like us. Their language capabilities were probably equivalent to ours. The anatomical structures required for complex speech, the descended larynx, the specialized throat anatomy, the precise tongue control, all of this had evolved by this time. The neural circuits for language processing were fully developed. They could communicate with the same complexity and nuance that we can. And they needed that sophisticated communication because their technology was incredibly complex. The stone tools used by humans 70,000 years ago weren't simple rocks with sharp edges. They were carefully engineered implements that required specialized knowledge to manufacture. Take the blade technology that had been developing in Africa for tens of thousands of years. To make a blade, you first have to prepare a stone core by carefully shaping it to create the right angles and curvatures. Then you strike the core at exactly the right spot with exactly the right force to detach a long, thin blade with sharp parallel edges. Each core can produce dozens of blades, but only if you know what you're doing. Learning to make blades requires years of training. Modern researchers who try to learn these techniques often need a decade or more to achieve the level of skill that would have been standard among adult humans 70,000 years ago. It's not just about hitting rocks together, it's about understanding the internal structure of different stone types, recognizing how fractures will propagate, controlling force and angle with incredible precision. But they weren't just making simple blades. They were creating composite tools, implements made from multiple parts joined together, spear points hafted to wooden shafts with plant resin adhesives, scrapers attached to handles, backed blades where one edge is deliberately blunted to allow safe handling. These composite tools required planning multiple steps ahead, gathering different materials from different sources, and understanding the properties of various adhesives and binding materials. They were also making tools from materials other than stone. Bone tools become more common in the archaeological record from this period. Awls for punching holes in hides, needles for sewing, harpoons for fishing, and polishers for processing leather. Each of these required different manufacturing techniques and specialized knowledge. And they were using ochre, a type of iron oxide that produces red and yellow pigments. Ochre processing sites from this period show that humans were mining ochre from specific sources, heating it to change its color properties, grinding it into powder, and mixing it with various binders to create paints and pigments. What were they using it for? Body decoration is one obvious answer. Ethnographic studies of modern hunter-gatherer society show that body painting serves multiple purposes: social signaling, ritual practices, group identification, and even practical functions like sun protection and insect repellent. But they were also creating art, the oldest known figurative art, sculptures and drawings that represent real objects, dates to around 40,000 years ago. But abstract art, geometric patterns, and symbolic markings goes back much further. Ochre pieces with engraved geometric patterns have been found at sites dating to 70,000 years ago and earlier. These engravings aren't random scratches, they're deliberate, repeated patterns, cross-hatching, parallel lines, geometric designs. They required planning, fine motor control, and symbolic thinking. Someone looked at a piece of ochre and decided to make marks on it that represented something, communicated something, meant something beyond just the physical marks themselves. This is the cognitive capacity that allowed humans to survive the bottleneck. Not just the ability to make tools, but the ability to think abstractly, to plan for the future, to communicate complex ideas, to create meaning and culture that transcended immediate survival needs. But technology and cognition alone wouldn't have been enough. What really saved humanity during the bottleneck was social organization, the ability to cooperate in large groups, share resources, maintain alliances, and pass knowledge across generations. Early human groups weren't just random collections of individuals. They were sophisticated social networks with complex structures, kin relationships, reciprocal obligations, status hierarchies, and shared cultural practices. These social bonds were as important for survival as any tool or technique. When resources are scarce, social cooperation becomes crucial. Food sharing ensures that everyone gets fed even when hunting or gathering is unsuccessful. Care for the sick and injured keeps valuable individuals alive and productive. Collaborative child rearing allows parents to continue contributing to group survival while their children are young. But human social groups also had something unique: the ability to maintain connections with other groups across large distances. Trade networks, marriage exchanges, and periodic gatherings allowed separate bands to stay in contact, share information, and provide mutual support during difficult times. Archaeological evidence for these long-distance connections comes from finding raw materials far from their sources. Obsidian, a volcanic glass used for making extremely sharp tools, shows up at sites hundreds of kilometers from the nearest obsidian source. Marine shells used for decoration are found far inland. High-quality stone tool materials traveled across regions. These materials didn't just randomly migrate. They moved through trade networks, passed from group to group through exchange relationships. Someone in coastal area would give shells to an inland group in exchange for something else. That inland group might then trade those shells to another group further inland. And so on, creating chains of connection that spanned hundreds of kilometers. These networks weren't just about moving materials, they were information highways. If one group discovered a new food source, a new tool technique, or a better way to process hides, that knowledge could spread through the network to dozens of other groups within a few years. During the bottleneck, these networks became survival lifelines. When one area experienced drought, groups could migrate to regions where water was still available, following connections to allied groups who would accept them. When game populations crashed in one region, information about where animals were still plentiful could spread through the network. The genetic evidence actually supports this idea of connected populations. While the overall human population was very small during the bottleneck, the genetic data doesn't show signs of complete isolation between groups. There was some gene flow, some exchange of individuals between populations, even during the worst periods. This suggests that humans managed to maintain at least minimal social connections, even when scattered across separate refugia. Small groups might have made dangerous journeys to visit neighboring populations, exchanging marriage partners and information. During periods of slightly better climate, separated populations might have temporarily reunited before scattering again when conditions deteriorated. This social flexibility, the ability to adjust group size and structure based on environmental conditions, was crucial for surviving the bottleneck. When resources were plentiful, groups could grow larger. When resources became scarce, groups could split into smaller units that could survive on less. But the social bonds remained, allowing fractured groups to reunite when circumstances allowed. The humans of 70,000 years ago also had something that earlier hominins had only partially developed: full symbolic culture. They could create arbitrary symbols that represented complex ideas, use these symbols to communicate abstract concepts, and build shared belief systems that unified their groups. This symbolic capacity is uniquely human and uniquely powerful. It allows humans to cooperate with people they've never met, based on shared symbols and cultural practices. If you encountered a stranger but recognized their tools, their body decorations, or their ritual practices as similar to yours, you could reasonably assume they were safe to interact with. Symbolic culture also provides psychological resilience during difficult times. Belief systems that give meaning to suffering, that promise better times ahead or that provide explanations for hardship. These help people endure conditions that might otherwise break their will to survive. Ritual practices serve similar functions. Group ceremonies reinforce social bonds, provide emotional support, and create shared experiences that unify communities. When people are struggling to survive, maintaining morale and group cohesion becomes as important as finding food and water. Evidence for ritual behaviour at this time is limited because rituals often don't leave clear archaeological traces, but there are hints. Careful burials with grave goods suggest belief in an afterlife or respect for the dead. Ochre use in burial contexts suggests ritual practices. Deliberately placed objects at certain sites might indicate special or sacred locations. These practices weren't just superstition, they were social technologies that helped maintain group cohesion and individual psychological health during extended periods of hardship. And during the bottleneck, when conditions were at their worst, these social and psychological supports might have made the difference between groups that gave up and groups that kept fighting to survive. So the humans who went into the bottleneck were sophisticated, intelligent, technologically advanced people with complex social systems and rich cultural lives. They had everything they needed to survive almost anything the environment could throw at them, but they were about to face challenges that would push even their formidable capabilities to the absolute limit. Understanding exactly what happened during those critical millennia requires piecing together evidence from multiple sources. The climate data, the archaeology, the genetics, and the ethnographic studies of modern hunter-gatherers all contribute pieces to the puzzle. And when you put it all together, a picture emerges of humanity's darkest hour and finest achievement. The crisis probably didn't hit all at once. The climate had been gradually deteriorating for thousands of years before Toba erupted. Humans were already adapting to drier conditions, changing their settlement patterns, and adjusting their subsistence strategies. But they were coping. Population numbers might have been lower than they'd been in previous millennia, but humans were still widespread across Africa and had even begun expanding into the Middle East. Then Toba exploded. Within weeks, the sky darkened with volcanic aerosols. Temperatures plummeted. The monsoons that brought critical rainfall to Africa weakened or failed. Plants died, animals either migrated away or starved. Water sources dried up even faster than they had been. For humans already living on the edge, this was catastrophic. Groups that had been sustainable suddenly weren't. Resources that had been scarce became non-existent. Territories that had been marginal became uninhabitable. The archaeological record suggests that many human populations simply didn't make it through this period. Sites that had been continuously occupied for thousands of years were abandoned. The geographic range of human occupation contracted dramatically. Only in a few specific areas do we find continuous evidence of human presence through the worst periods of the crisis. So where did the survivors manage to hang on? The genetic evidence suggests that most or all of the humans who made it through the bottleneck were in Africa, probably in multiple separate refugia. Some researchers think coastal areas were crucial, particularly along the southern coast of Africa, where marine resources would have provided alternative food sources when terrestrial ecosystems collapsed. The southern coast of South Africa has a unique climate pattern influenced by both the Atlantic and Indian Oceans. Even during the worst of the Ice Age, This region maintained relatively stable conditions. There were caves providing shelter, freshwater springs, and rich marine ecosystems with shellfish, seals, and fish. Archaeological sites like Blombos Cave and Pinnacle Point show continuous human occupation through the period of the bottleneck. These sites contain sophisticated artifacts, ochre processing debris, and evidence of advanced technologies like heat-treated stone tools and marine resource exploitation. The inhabitants of these coastal caves were doing more than just surviving. They were innovating. Some of the most sophisticated artifacts from the entire Middle Stone Age come from this time period. Microlithic tools, tiny blade fragments that could be hafted together to create composite tools. Bone tools, including needles and awls. Engraved ochre pieces with complex geometric patterns, perforated shells used as beads. These aren't the products of people barely clinging to survival. These are the products of people who maintained their full cultural and technological sophistication even under extreme environmental pressure. They were still making art, still innovating with their tools, still engaging in the full range of human cultural behaviour. But the coast wasn't the only refugium. Other populations probably survived in highland areas where local climate patterns were different from the general trend. In the East African highlands, higher elevations would have maintained cooler temperatures and more reliable rainfall even as lowland areas turned to desert. Archaeological evidence from sites in Ethiopia and Kenya suggests continuous or near-continuous occupation through this period. These highland populations had their own sophisticated technologies adapted to their specific environment. They were hunting highland game species, gathering highland plant foods, and manufacturing tools from local raw materials. Some researchers have proposed that populations also survived in the interior of southern Africa, possibly in the region around the Okavango Delta or other areas where underground water sources maintained wetland environments even during severe droughts. The genetic evidence shows that some distinct lineages survived the bottleneck separately before reconnecting later, suggesting multiple refugia rather than a single survival location. These scattered populations, separated by hundreds or thousands of kilometers of increasingly hostile territory, faced similar challenges but solved them in locally specific ways. Coastal groups relied heavily on marine resources. Highland groups adapted to cooler temperatures and different plant and animal communities. Interior groups may have focused on exploiting wetland resources and underground water sources. But all of them had to deal with the fundamental problem of surviving in isolated small groups with limited genetic diversity and no external support. This is where the real test came. Not just weathering the initial crisis, but maintaining viable populations for generation after generation while conditions remained catastrophic. Small populations face unique challenges that larger populations don't have to worry about. Random demographic events, like an unusually high number of deaths in a particular year, can have devastating effects. If several key individuals die in accidents, from disease, or in childbirth, a small group might not recover. Genetic problems accumulate quickly in small populations. When everyone is closely related, inbreeding is inevitable. This increases the probability that harmful recessive genes will be expressed, leading to genetic disorders and reduced fertility. The technical term is inbreeding depression, and it's a major factor in the extinction of small populations. Social problems also emerge. With only 30 or 40 individuals in a group, personal conflicts can't be resolved by one party moving to a different group. Everyone is stuck with everyone else. If key individuals don't get along, if social tensions escalate, if leadership disputes arise, there's no easy solution. The humans who survived the bottleneck had to navigate all of these challenges simultaneously. They had to find enough food and water in degraded environments. They had to maintain social cohesion in small, stressed groups. They had to manage genetics carefully, probably through deliberate strategies to minimize inbreeding. They had to preserve crucial knowledge even as populations were so small that losing a single knowledgeable individual could be catastrophic. One way they might have managed genetics was through maintaining connections with neighbouring groups even when separated by hostile territory. Young adults, particularly women, might have been deliberately exchanged between groups to prevent inbreeding. This would require dangerous journeys across difficult terrain, but the genetic benefits would be enormous. Archaeological evidence for such connections comes from finding similar artifact styles at distant sites and from discovering raw materials that travelled significant distances even during the bottleneck period. Obsidian and marine shells still moved across regions, indicating that some trade and contact continued even during the worst times. Groups might have also practiced seasonal aggregation, coming together during periods of slightly better conditions to exchange marriage partners, trade goods, share information, and conduct social and ritual activities before dispersing again to separate territories. Modern hunter-gatherer societies often use this strategy, and it's plausible that bottleneck survivors did too. Preserving knowledge was another critical challenge. In pre-literate societies, all knowledge exists in human memory. The best tool makers, the most knowledgeable plant specialists, the people who remembered the locations of distant water sources. Losing these individuals meant losing irreplaceable information. Humans probably dealt with this through redundant knowledge systems. Critical information wasn't held by just one person. It was shared across multiple individuals and passed down deliberately through teaching and apprenticeship. Children began learning crucial survival skills at young ages, ensuring knowledge was transmitted before older generations died. Storytelling also played a role in knowledge preservation. Information embedded in stories is easier to remember than abstract facts. The location of a water source becomes a story about ancestors who found it. The properties of medicinal plants become stories about how they were discovered. The dangers of certain territories become stories about what happened to people who went there. These narrative knowledge systems are remarkably effective. Modern Aboriginal Australians have oral traditions that accurately preserve information about landscape features and events from over 10,000 years ago, passed down through more than 400 generations. The bottleneck survivors probably used similar systems to preserve crucial survival information across generations. But perhaps the most important survival strategy was psychological. Humans had to maintain hope, maintain social bonds, maintain their cultural identity and sense of meaning even when everything seemed hopeless. This is where ritual, art, music, and symbolic culture became crucial. Creating art during a survival crisis might seem like a waste of precious time and energy, but art serves important psychological and social functions. It provides emotional release, creates beauty in harsh circumstances, and maintains the sense of being human rather than just surviving animals. The engraved ochre pieces, the beads made from shells, the carefully crafted tools that are more beautiful than strictly necessary, all of this represents humans refusing to give up their humanity even in the worst imaginable circumstances. They weren't just trying to survive, they were trying to survive as human beings with culture, meaning and dignity. This psychological resilience, this refusal to give up, might be the most important factor that allowed humans to make it through the bottleneck. Other hominin species had similar technologies and possibly even similar social systems. Neanderthals in Europe and Denisovans in Asia were going through their own climate crises at the same time, but only Homo sapiens emerged from this period to eventually colonize the entire planet. What made the difference? Possibly our symbolic culture, our ability to create meaning and maintain hope through the darkest times. Possibly our social flexibility, our capacity to adjust group structures and maintain far-flung connections. Possibly just luck, we'll never know for certain, but we do know that those 2,000 breeding individuals spread across multiple small groups in separated refugia managed to keep humanity alive through thousands of years of crisis. They maintained enough genetic diversity to avoid extinction through inbreeding depression. They preserved their technologies and cultural traditions. They maintained their social networks, even when separated by hostile territory. They kept having children and teaching them everything they knew, passing the torch of human knowledge and culture from generation to generation, even when the future must have seemed impossibly dark. And eventually, gradually, conditions began to improve. The volcanic aerosols cleared from the atmosphere. The climate remained cold, but not catastrophically so. Rainfall patterns stabilized somewhat. Plants began to recover. Animals returned to areas they'd abandoned. The refugia slowly expanded as adjacent territories became habitable again. The surviving human groups began to grow. Small bands of 30 or 40 individuals became bands of 50 or 60, multiple bands reconnected and merged. The genetic bottleneck began to open as population numbers climbed back from the brink. By 60,000 years ago, the human population was recovering, not back to pre-crisis numbers yet, but growing steadily. And the survivors brought with them something new, all of the innovations, all of the survival strategies, all of the cultural and technological advances that had allowed them to survive the bottleneck. These became the foundation for everything that followed. The humans who emerged from the bottleneck weren't just random survivors. They were the descendants of the absolute best at everything. The best tool makers, the best foragers, the best social organizers, the best teachers, the best problem solvers. Natural selection during the bottleneck had been incredibly intense, weeding out any individual or group that wasn't exceptional. These post-bottleneck humans were primed for success. They had been tested in the worst possible conditions and had passed every test. Now they were about to expand out of Africa and colonize the entire planet in one of the most successful episodes of dispersal in the history of life on Earth. But before we get to that expansion, we need to understand one more crucial aspect of the bottleneck: its lasting impact on human genetics, human diversity, and human evolution. Because the bottleneck didn't just nearly end humanity, it fundamentally shaped what humanity would become. The genetic legacy of the bottleneck is written into every human genome alive today. When geneticists sequence someone's DNA, they can see the signature of that ancient population crash in multiple ways. The low overall genetic diversity compared to other species, the specific pattern of variation in different types of genetic markers, the relationships between different human populations around the world. One of the most striking findings is how similar all humans are at the genetic level. If you pick two people at random from anywhere on Earth and sequence their genomes, they'll be about 99.9% identical. That remaining 0.1% is what accounts for all the variation we see between individuals, all the differences in appearance, disease susceptibility, and other traits. But even within that 0.1%, most of the variation exists within populations rather than between them. If you compare two people from the same region, say two Nigerians or two Japanese people, they'll typically differ from each other as much as they differ from someone from a completely different part of the world. This is the opposite of what you'd expect if human populations had been separated for a long time. Species that have distinct, long isolated populations show much greater genetic differentiation between populations. The fact that humans don't shows that all modern human populations are recently descended from a common ancestral population. That ancestral population was the bottleneck survivors. The genetic relationships between different modern populations also reveal the post-bottleneck expansion pattern. African populations have the highest genetic diversity, indicating they've been in Africa the longest. Non-African populations have less diversity, consistent with being founded by small groups that left Africa relatively recently. Within Africa, certain populations show particularly high diversity and particularly deep genetic lineages. The San people of southern Africa and related Khoisan-speaking populations have genetic lineages that diverge from other humans earlier than any other population. This suggests they might be the direct descendants of one of the main refugia during the bottleneck, possibly those coastal populations in South Africa. Other African populations show different genetic signatures indicating descent from other refugia. East African populations, West African populations, and Central African populations all have distinct genetic characteristics while still being part of the overall human family tree. The genetic data has allowed scientists to reconstruct the basic pattern of post-bottleneck expansion. Around 60,000 to 70,000 years ago, human populations began growing again in Africa. By 50,000 to 60,000 years ago, small groups began migrating out of Africa, probably through the Middle East. These founder populations that left Africa carried only a subset of the genetic diversity present in Africa. This created a second, less severe bottleneck for non-African populations. Every human population outside of Africa descends from this small group of migrants, which is why non-African populations have less genetic diversity than African populations. From the Middle East, humans spread rapidly. By 45,000 years ago, they'd reached Australia. By 40,000 years ago, they were in Europe and Northern Asia. By 15,000 years ago, they'd crossed into the Americas. In less than 50,000 years, humans went from a few thousand individuals in Africa to populations on every continent except Antarctica. This expansion was possible because the bottleneck survivors had been so thoroughly tested and refined by natural selection. They had the best technologies, the best social systems, the best adaptive strategies. When they encountered new environments, they could adapt quickly, developing new technologies and subsistence strategies appropriate for local conditions. But the bottleneck's genetic legacy goes beyond just low diversity and recent common ancestry. It also affected disease susceptibility, genetic disorders, and evolutionary constraints on future human development. The loss of genetic diversity during the bottleneck meant that many genetic variants that existed in earlier human populations were lost forever. Some of these might have been harmful, but others might have provided protection against certain diseases or adaptation to specific environments. We'll never know what we lost because those genetic lineages went extinct. The bottleneck also increased the frequency of certain genetic variants through random drift. Some variants that were rare before the bottleneck became common afterwards simply because they happened to be present in the survivors. These variants aren't necessarily beneficial or harmful, just random genetic variants that increased in frequency by chance. Some researchers think the bottleneck might have even influenced certain aspects of human evolution after it ended. With such low genetic diversity, any new beneficial mutations would spread quickly through the entire population. This might have accelerated certain evolutionary changes in the period immediately after the bottleneck. There's also been speculation about whether the bottleneck selected for certain cognitive or behavioral traits. Did the extreme social cooperation required to survive the bottleneck select for genes that enhance social cognition, empathy, or cooperation? Did the need for innovation and flexibility select for genes that enhance creativity or adaptability? These questions are controversial because it's difficult to test them directly. We can't sequence DNA from humans who lived during the bottleneck to see what genetic variants were selected for or against, but we can look at genetic variants that show signs of recent strong selection in human populations, and some of these do relate to brain function, social behavior, and cognitive abilities. What's clear is that the bottleneck was a transformative event in human evolution, not just a close call that we barely survived, but a crucible that shaped the entire trajectory of human development afterward. The humans who emerged from the bottleneck were different from the humans who went into it, not biologically in a fundamental sense, but culturally, technologically, and behaviorally. They had proven that humans could survive anything, that with intelligence, cooperation, and determination, no environmental crisis was too severe. That human adaptability was essentially unlimited. These lessons, encoded in culture and behavior rather than just genes, became part of the human heritage passed down to every subsequent generation, and they had one more advantage that would prove crucial in the coming millennia. They had been refined by natural selection operating at maximum intensity. Every individual who survived the bottleneck, every ancestor of every person alive today, had proven their fitness in the harshest possible test. Their descendants inherited not just their genes, but their hard-won survival strategies and their refined technological and cultural traditions. This is why the post-bottleneck expansion was so successful. It wasn't just that humans got lucky and population numbers happened to recover, it's that the humans who emerged from the bottleneck were supremely well-adapted survivors who had been tested against the worst nature could throw at them and had passed every test. But there's another aspect of the bottleneck story that we need to address. How confident are we that this really happened? Is it possible that the genetic evidence has been misinterpreted? Could there be other explanations for the patterns we see in human DNA? These are legitimate questions that scientists have been debating for years. The bottleneck hypothesis is well supported, but like any scientific theory, it's based on interpretation of evidence and involves assumptions that might not be entirely correct. One challenge is that different genetic markers sometimes give slightly different estimates of bottleneck timing and severity. Mitochondrial DNA suggests one timeline, Y chromosome DNA suggests another. Nuclear genome data suggests a third. These differences aren't huge, and they might just reflect the inherent uncertainty in genetic dating methods, but they do introduce some ambiguity. There's also debate about whether the bottleneck was a single event or multiple separate events. Some researchers think there might have been several population crashes at different times, each reducing genetic diversity further. The single severe bottleneck around 70,000 years ago might actually be the last and most severe of several such events. Another complication is that genetic bottlenecks don't always show up clearly in DNA data. If a population crashes and then recovers quickly, the genetic signature can be subtle. If there's significant gene flow from neighboring populations during or after the bottleneck, it can mask the signal. Some researchers have argued that the human bottleneck might have been less severe or more complex than the simple story suggests. There's also the question of whether the Toba eruption was really the cause. While the timing matches well, correlation doesn't prove causation. The climate was already deteriorating before Toba erupted. Maybe the eruption just made a bad situation worse, or maybe it was unrelated to the bottleneck entirely. Some researchers have pointed out that other species show similar signs of population bottlenecks at around the same time, suggesting that whatever happened affected many species across Africa and Asia, not just humans. This supports the idea of a major environmental crisis, but doesn't necessarily prove that Toba was the cause. Recent archaeological work has also complicated the picture. Some sites show continuous occupation through the period that should correspond to the bottleneck. Some researchers interpret this as evidence that the bottleneck wasn't as severe as genetic data suggests, at least not everywhere. But the weight of evidence still strongly supports a significant bottleneck occurring around 50,000 to 80,000 years ago. Multiple independent lines of genetic evidence point to a severe population reduction. Archaeological data, while complex, generally shows decreased human activity during this period. Climate data confirms that conditions were extremely harsh. The Toba eruption provides a plausible trigger mechanism. The exact details, the precise number of survivors, the specific locations of refugia, the duration of the bottleneck, these are still being refined as new data becomes available. But the basic story appears solid. Humans nearly went extinct during the last ice age. Survival population was very small, possibly only a couple thousand breeding individuals, and all modern humans descend from those survivors. And that brings us to the profound implications of this story for understanding humanity today. What does it mean that we all descend from those 2,000 survivors? What does the bottleneck tell us about human nature, human potential, and human future? First and most obviously, it means we're all closely related. Every human on Earth shares ancestors who lived through the bottleneck. We're not just the same species in an abstract biological sense. We're literally all cousins, all members of the same extended family that traces back to those few thousand survivors. This has important implications for how we think about human diversity. The differences we see between populations, skin color, facial features, body proportions, all of this variation arose very recently, probably within the last 50,000 years, as humans adapted to different environments after leaving Africa. These superficial differences, which have been used throughout history to justify discrimination and conflict, are evolutionarily trivial. They're recent adaptations to local conditions, no more significant than the differences in coat colour between dogs or the differences in beak shape between finch populations. At a deeper genetic level, at the level that really matters for fundamental human characteristics, we're remarkably uniform. This is because we all descend from that small bottleneck population. We share the same basic genetic toolkit, the same cognitive capabilities, the same emotional range, the same fundamental human nature. This doesn't mean there's no genetic variation between individuals or populations. There obviously is, but it means that variation is relatively minor compared to what you'd see in a species with a longer, more stable population history. And it means that whatever divides humans, whatever causes conflicts between groups, it's not fundamental biological differences. It's culture, history, competition for resources, and political structures, not genetics. The bottleneck also tells us something profound about human resilience and adaptability. Our ancestors survived the worst environmental crisis they'd ever faced. They survived when other species went extinct. They survived when the planet became almost uninhabitable. They survived through intelligence, cooperation, and sheer determination. This resilience is part of our heritage. When we face challenges today, when we worry about climate change or resource scarcity or environmental degradation, we can remember that our ancestors faced worse and made it through. This isn't an argument for complacency or denial. The challenges we face are real and serious. But it's a reminder that humans are capable of extraordinary adaptation when necessary. The bottleneck also highlights the importance of diversity for species survival. The humans who made it through weren't all from one location or one population. They were spread across multiple refugia, maintaining genetic and cultural diversity even in small numbers. This diversity was crucial for survival because different populations faced different local challenges and needed different solutions. Today, as human cultures around the world face pressures to homogenize, as traditional knowledge systems disappear, as languages go extinct, we're losing diversity that took tens of thousands of years to develop. The bottleneck reminds us that diversity isn't just aesthetically valuable or politically correct. It's a survival strategy that has proven essential for human success. The bottleneck also offers lessons about the relationship between population size and innovation. You might think that larger populations would always be more innovative simply because there are more individuals to come up with new ideas. But the bottleneck shows that small populations under extreme pressure can be incredibly innovative when they need to be. The archaeological evidence shows continued technological innovation through the bottleneck period. Humans didn't just survive by doing what they'd always done. They invented new technologies, developed new strategies, and found creative solutions to unprecedented problems. Small populations can innovate rapidly when survival depends on it. This might be relevant for thinking about human societies today. Innovation doesn't require massive populations or huge institutions. It requires creativity, necessity, and the freedom to experiment. The bottleneck survivors had all three. There's also a more philosophical implication. The fact that humanity nearly went extinct suggests that our current success isn't inevitable or guaranteed. We're not the destined rulers of Earth, the inevitable end point of evolution. We're survivors who got incredibly lucky and made the most of that luck. This perspective might foster a certain humility about our place in nature. We're not separate from or above the natural world. We're part of it, subject to the same evolutionary forces and environmental constraints as every other species. Our technology and intelligence give us advantages, but they don't make us invulnerable. The bottleneck also raises questions about what makes humans special. If we nearly went extinct, if we were reduced to a tiny remnant population barely hanging on, what allowed us to recover when other species in similar situations went extinct permanently? Part of the answer is probably luck. Enough refugia had sufficient resources. The climate recovered before we'd been pushed past the point of no return. Random chance favored our survival, but part of the answer is also human nature. Our cognitive flexibility, our social cooperation, our cultural transmission of knowledge, our symbolic thinking and ability to create meaning. These uniquely human characteristics were crucial for surviving the bottleneck. This suggests that what makes humans special isn't just our big brains or our technologies. It's the combination of cognitive, social, and cultural capabilities that allows us to adapt to challenges through learning and cooperation rather than just genetic evolution. We're the species that can change our behavior and technology in a single generation, allowing rapid adaptation to changing conditions. The bottleneck story also connects us to our ancestors in a very personal way. When you think about your family tree, you usually think back a few generations, parents, grandparents, maybe great-grandparents. But the bottleneck reminds us that we can trace our ancestry back thousands of generations to specific individuals who survived specific events. Somewhere in your family tree, going back about 2,500 to 3,000 generations, is someone who survived the bottleneck. Someone who lived through the Toba eruption, who endured the volcanic winter, who maintained their humanity and their hope through years of hardship. Someone who had children and taught them everything they knew, passing the torch of human culture and knowledge forward to the next generation. That ancestor is your direct line to humanity's darkest hour and finest moment. You exist because that person survived, because they were tough enough, smart enough, and lucky enough to make it through when so many others didn't. You carry their genes, and in a sense you carry their legacy of survival and perseverance. This creates a kind of responsibility. Our ancestors fought so hard to survive, endured so much to pass their genes and culture forward, it seems almost wasteful to squander that inheritance on trivial concerns or destructive conflicts. The bottleneck survivors kept humanity alive so that future generations, us, could thrive and build and create. What would they think of what we've done with the world they saved? What would they think of the civilizations we've built, the technologies we've developed, the knowledge we've accumulated? What would they think of the ways we've used and misused our extraordinary human capabilities? These aren't just abstract philosophical questions. They're relevant for thinking about human priorities and values today. If we remember where we came from, if we understand how close we came to not existing at all, it might influence how we think about our responsibilities to future generations. The bottleneck also offers perspective on current human population debates. Some people worry that human population growth is unsustainable, that we're heading for resource crises and environmental collapse. Others argue that human ingenuity can solve any problem, that there's no real limit to how many people Earth can support. The bottleneck reminds us that human populations can crash as well as grow. We've been through periods of extreme scarcity when the human population was reduced to a tiny fraction of its previous size. We've also been through periods of rapid expansion when human populations grew exponentially. What determines whether populations grow or shrink isn't just birth rates or resources. It's the relationship between human societies and their environments, the technologies and social systems that allow humans to extract resources sustainably or unsustainably, and the random environmental events that can disrupt even the most stable societies. The bottleneck teaches us that human success isn't guaranteed, that populations can collapse rapidly when conditions change, but also that humans are incredibly resilient and can recover from even severe crises if enough survivors maintain the knowledge and culture necessary for rebuilding. These lessons feel increasingly relevant as we face potential environmental crises in the 21st century. Climate change, resource depletion, ecosystem degradation, these challenges aren't unprecedented in human history. Our ancestors faced similar challenges during the bottleneck and found ways to survive. Of course, there are important differences. The bottleneck was caused by natural climate change and volcanic eruption, events beyond human control. Today's environmental challenges are largely human-caused, which creates both problems and opportunities. The problems are that we can't just wait for natural climate cycles to improve conditions. If we've caused the problems, we need to solve them. The opportunities are that if we've caused the problems, we have the power to fix them or at least mitigate them. The bottleneck survivors couldn't stop the ice age or prevent volcanic eruptions. They could only adapt to the conditions they faced. We, by contrast, have the capability to alter our own behavior, change our technologies, and modify our impact on the environment. Whether we will actually do these things is another question, but the capability exists. The bottleneck also offers perspective on human genetic engineering and biotechnology. As we gain the ability to modify human genes, to select embryos for desired traits, to potentially enhance human capabilities, the bottleneck reminds us that human genetic diversity is already limited. We've been through a severe bottleneck that reduced our genetic variation dramatically. This means that human populations are probably more vulnerable to certain genetic risks than populations with higher diversity. It also means that further reducing diversity through selection or engineering could have unforeseen consequences. The genetic variation that exists in human populations, limited though it is, has been selected over hundreds of thousands of years of evolution. Tinkering with it requires careful thought about potential consequences. On the other hand, the bottleneck also shows that humans can survive and thrive with relatively low genetic diversity. We're not doomed by our limited genetic variation. In fact, our success since the bottleneck suggests that culture, learning, and technology can compensate for genetic limitations. The question isn't whether genetic diversity matters, it obviously does, but how much we should worry about it versus other factors like cultural diversity, knowledge preservation, and technological innovation. The bottleneck survivors maintained both genetic and cultural diversity, and both were probably important for their success. All of these implications and lessons ultimately point back to the same fundamental insight. Humans are survivors. We've been tested by nature at its harshest and have proven our resilience. We carry within us the legacy of ancestors who refused to give up, who maintained their humanity through impossible circumstances, who passed forward their knowledge and culture through the darkest times. This legacy manifests in multiple ways. Genetically, we carry the specific alleles and genetic variants that happen to be present in the bottleneck survivors. These aren't necessarily optimal genes, just the ones that survived the random process of genetic drift through a severe population bottleneck. But they're our genetic heritage, the basic human genome that all 8 billion of us share. Culturally, we inherit the technologies and social systems that allowed bottleneck survivors to endure. Not directly, of course. Modern cultures have evolved far beyond what existed 70,000 years ago. But the foundations, the basic human capacities for tool-making, language, social cooperation, symbolic thinking, all of these were preserved and refined during the bottleneck. Behaviorally and psychologically, we inherit traits that were probably selected for during the bottleneck. The ability to cooperate with strangers based on shared cultural symbols, the capacity to maintain hope and meaning during hardship, the flexibility to adapt rapidly to changing conditions, the creativity to solve novel problems. These aren't uniquely human traits, but they're highly developed in humans, possibly because they were essential for bottleneck survival. Perhaps most importantly, we inherit the knowledge that humans can survive almost anything. This isn't just abstract knowledge from history books. It's embodied knowledge, encoded in human culture and psychology. We're the descendants of survivors, and that survivor mentality is part of what makes us human. But the bottleneck story also reminds us that survival isn't passive. It requires active effort, intelligence, cooperation, and sometimes luck. The bottleneck survivors didn't make it through by accident. They made it through by being smart, adaptable, and social, by maintaining their technologies and knowledge, by supporting each other through hardship, by refusing to give up even when the odds seemed impossible. These same qualities are still present in humans today. When faced with disasters, humans often respond with remarkable courage and mutual support. When confronted with new challenges, humans often prove incredibly creative and adaptable. When conditions seem hopeless, humans often find ways to persevere. The bottleneck isn't just ancient history, it's a mirror showing us human nature at its most fundamental. Stripped of civilization, technology, and comfortable living, reduced to small groups struggling to survive in hostile environments, humans responded with intelligence, cooperation, and determination. They didn't become brutal or give up their humanity. They doubled down on the things that make us human: creativity, culture, social bonds, and hope. That's the ultimate lesson of the bottleneck. We're not just smart apes who got lucky. We're a species refined by extreme adversity, tested by nature's harshest conditions, and proven capable of surviving almost anything through our uniquely human combination of intelligence and cooperation. The story of how 2,000 humans saved our species from extinction isn't just about those specific 2,000 individuals. It's about what it means to be human, about the capabilities we possess, about where we came from and what we're capable of. Every time you solve a problem creatively, you're using cognitive abilities refined during the bottleneck. Every time you cooperate with someone to achieve a shared goal, you're engaging in social behaviors that kept small groups alive during the crisis. Every time you teach something to a child, you're participating in the knowledge transmission system that preserved human culture through the darkest times. The 2,000 individuals who saved our species didn't do it alone. They did it as part of social groups and cultural traditions that stretched back hundreds of thousands of years and forward to everyone alive today. They were links in a chain of human culture and knowledge that has been passed down through tens of thousands of generations. And you're part of that chain. You carry the genetic heritage of the bottleneck survivors. You inherit their cultural and technological legacy. You possess the same fundamental human capabilities that allowed them to survive the worst environmental crisis in human history. What you do with that inheritance is up to you, but knowing where it comes from, understanding what was required to pass it forward, that knowledge changes how you think about being human. We almost didn't make it. We came closer to extinction than most people realize, but those 2,000 individuals spread across scattered refugia in Africa refused to give up. They survived through intelligence, cooperation, and sheer determination. They maintained their humanity, their culture, and their hope through thousands of years of crisis. And because they survived, because they passed their genes and knowledge forward, here we are, 8 billion strong, spread across every continent, master survivors who have proven capable of adapting to any environment Earth can throw at us. The bottleneck nearly ended humanity. Instead, it proved what humans are capable of. It showed that we're survivors. It demonstrated that human adaptability is essentially unlimited. It revealed that with intelligence and cooperation, no challenge is insurmountable. That's the legacy of the bottleneck. That's what we inherit from those 2,000 ancestors who saved our species, not just their genes, but their example, their proof that humans can survive anything, and their demonstration of what it truly means to be human. We've covered the what and the how of the bottleneck, but now we need to dive deeper into the actual lived experience of those survivors and what their world was really like. Because understanding the bottleneck isn't just about numbers and genetic data. It's about imagining what it meant to be one of those 2,000 people trying to survive when the world was ending. Let's put ourselves in their position. It's 72,000 years ago. You're living in what will someday be called South Africa along the southern coast. Your group consists of about 35 people, 3 extended families that have been traveling together for as long as anyone can remember. You know every single person in your group intimately. There are no strangers, no anonymity, no privacy in the modern sense. You wake up in a rock shelter overlooking the ocean. The shelter isn't a deep cave, but a shallow overhang that protects you from wind and rain while still giving you visibility of the surrounding area. This visibility is crucial because predators are everywhere. Cave bears, lions, leopards, hyenas. All of them see humans as potential prey. The sun is just starting to rise, painting the sky in shades of red and orange, but something's wrong with the sunrise. It's dimmer than it should be, filtered through a haze that's been there for months now. Ever since the night the earth shook and the sky lit up with distant fire, ever since ash started falling from the sky like grey snow, the sun hasn't looked right. You don't know that a volcano called Toba exploded thousands of kilometers away. You don't understand volcanic aerosols or nuclear winter scenarios. You just know that the sky changed, the temperature dropped, and everything started dying. Your group has been at this coastal shelter for 3 seasons now. Normally, you'd be nomadic, following the seasonal movements of game animals and the ripening of plant foods. But there are no game animals anymore. They've all migrated away or starved. The plant foods that used to be abundant have shriveled and died. The interior territories where your people once travelled are now too dry to support human life. So you've stayed at the coast because here, at least, there are still resources. Shellfish clinging to rocks at low tide, seals that occasionally haul out on the beaches, fish that can be caught in tidal pools, seaweed that can be eaten when processed properly. It's not the diet your ancestors preferred, but it's keeping you alive. You've become expert at reading the tides, at knowing exactly when and where to find the best shellfish, at predicting when seals might appear. This knowledge wasn't passed down from your parents. It's new knowledge, developed through experimentation and observation over the past few years. As your group adapted to coastal living, the older members of your group still tell stories about the interior lands, about vast herds of game animals and forests full of edible plants. But those younger than about 15 have never seen those places. They've grown up on the coast, and for them this harsh existence is normal. You stretch and move toward the fire that never goes out. Keeping the fire alive is one of the group's most important responsibilities. You have methods for making new fire, friction methods using wooden drills, and techniques for striking sparks from certain rocks. But these methods are difficult and time-consuming. It's much easier to never let the fire go out in the first place. The fire is tended in shifts throughout the night. Right now, an elderly woman named, well, you don't have names in the way we understand them, but let's call her Elder. She's watching the fire. She's probably in her late 40s, which makes her ancient by the standards of your world. Most people don't live past 35. Disease, injury, childbirth complications, infections, predator attacks, accidents, all of these cut lives short. But Elder has survived everything the world has thrown at her, and in the process, she's accumulated an irreplaceable store of knowledge. She knows more about plant medicines than anyone else in the group. She remembers the locations of water sources deep in the interior, information that might be crucial if your group ever needs to move. She can predict weather patterns by reading cloud formations and animal behaviour. Losing Elder would be catastrophic, not just emotionally, though the group loves her, but practically. Her knowledge base represents decades of accumulated experience that can't be quickly replaced. This is why the group takes care of her, shares food with her even when she can't contribute much physically, and protects her from dangers. You exchange greetings with Elder. Your language is fully developed, as complex and nuanced as any modern language. You can discuss abstract concepts, tell stories about the past and plan for the future, express emotions and ideas with precision. The myth of grunting cave people is just that, a myth. You communicate with the same sophistication as any modern human. Elder tells you that during the night watch she heard lions in the distance. This is concerning. Lions are one of the few predators that will actively hunt adult humans. A pride of hungry lions could devastate your small group. You'll need to be extra cautious today. Maybe organise a watch system while people are out gathering food. The rest of the group is waking up now. Children first, as always. They're the most adaptable to the strange sleeping schedule imposed by the need for constant vigilance. Then the young adults, the primary food gatherers and hunters. Finally, the middle-aged adults who handle the complex tasks of tool maintenance, hide processing, and food preparation. Everyone has roles, but these roles are flexible. There's no rigid division of labour by sex or age. Yes, men do most of the hunting of large game, when there is any large game to hunt. Yes, women do most of the infant care, because they're nursing. But everyone gathers plant foods, everyone knows how to make tools, everyone can perform most survival tasks when necessary. This flexibility is crucial for a small group's survival. If you had strict gender roles and the primary hunters were killed or injured, the group would starve. If only certain people could make tools and those people died, the group would lose critical technology. Everyone needs to be able to do everything, even if some people are more skilled at certain tasks. The morning routine is efficient because it's been refined over thousands of generations. No wasted motion, no unnecessary steps. Check weapons and tools, bank the fire properly for the day, organise into foraging groups, brief discussion of the day's plans. Today, the plan is simple. One group will work the tidal pools and collect shellfish. Another will search for bird eggs along the cliffs. A third will process hides and maintain tools at the shelter. And a small group of the best trackers will scout inland to see if any game animals have returned to the region. You're part of the scouting group. It's dangerous work, travelling into territory that might not have been visited by humans in months, but someone needs to keep checking. If the climate is improving, if animals are returning, you need to know about it immediately. Your scouting party consists of 4 people, 2 men and 2 women, all in their prime, all experienced trackers and hunters. You carry weapons, spears with beautifully crafted stone points, hafted securely to wooden shafts with plant resin adhesive. These spears aren't throwing spears, they're thrusting spears meant for close quarters combat with predators or for finishing wounded game. You also carry smaller tools, stone knives for cutting, scrapers for processing hides, and a precious fire-carrying device, a smouldering coal wrapped in bark and clay that will allow you to start a fire quickly if needed. Fire is safety. Fire is survival. You don't travel without it. The inland journey takes you away from the coast, climbing up the escarpment into the interior. The landscape is heartbreaking. What should be woodland is now scrubland. What should be scrubland is desert. The streams are dry, the water holes are empty, nothing grows, nothing moves. You find the tracks of a small antelope near a dried-up water source. The tracks are several days old, but they're the first animal sign you've seen in weeks. This is mildly encouraging. If small antelope are surviving somewhere, that means there's vegetation somewhere, which means conditions might be slowly improving. But you also find tracks of a large predator, possibly a lion or leopard, following the antelope tracks. The predators are as desperate as everything else, and desperate predators are dangerous predators. They'll take risks they normally wouldn't, like attacking humans. You mark the antelope trail with a small cairn of stones, a signal for future scouting parties. Then you continue your sweep of the territory, looking for any other signs of returning life. You find a few birds, some insects, and evidence that a small rodent population is surviving in underground burrows. It's not much, but it's something. By late afternoon, you've covered about 15 kilometers of territory. Your mental map of the region is incredibly detailed. You know every landmark, every potential water source, every shelter location, every game trail. This cognitive mapping ability is one of humanity's great evolutionary advantages. You can navigate vast territories using only landmarks and spatial memory. The return to the coast takes you through different terrain, maximizing your survey coverage. As you descend back toward the ocean, you can smell the salt air and hear the waves. The coast has become home in a way the interior territories never were. Your ancestors were primarily inland people, but you've become coastal specialists, adapted to a marine-oriented lifestyle. Back at the shelter, the other groups have returned with their hauls. The shellfish collectors have done well. Several baskets full of mussels, limpets, and abalone. The egg hunters found a few seabird nests, a valuable source of protein and fat. The hide processors have prepared 2 antelope skins that were taken weeks ago, finally finishing the labor-intensive process of scraping, treating, and softening them. The group gathers for the evening meal. This is more than just eating. It's social time, the opportunity for the group to bond, share information, tell stories, and reinforce relationships. In a group, this small social cohesion is critical. Conflicts that can't be resolved can tear the group apart, and in your world, being expelled from the group is a death sentence. The food is shared according to complex social rules that ensure everyone gets enough. Nursing mothers and young children eat first, then the elderly, then the adults who did the most physically demanding work, than everyone else. This sharing system prevents resentment and ensures that the most vulnerable group members are cared for. As you eat, people report on their day's activities. The shellfish collectors describe the tides and what they found. The egg hunters talk about seabird behavior patterns. You report on the animal tracks you found inland, and the group discusses what this might mean. Elder interprets the signs. She thinks the climate might be slowly improving, that the strange haze in the sky has been clearing gradually, that temperatures might be rising slightly. This is based on subtle observations, the behavior of birds, the flowering patterns of coastal plants, the temperature of the ocean water, the timing of tides. Whether she's right or not, the interpretation provides hope. And hope is crucial for survival. Groups that lose hope, that give up believing conditions will improve, those groups stop trying. They stop innovating, stop adapting, and stop caring for each other. They die not from starvation, but from despair. Your group hasn't lost hope because you actively maintain it through stories, rituals, and shared beliefs. The evening meal includes storytelling, and tonight Elder tells the story of the Great Journey, a mythological tale about ancestral humans who survived an even worse crisis by traveling to a magical land where food was always abundant. Is the story literally true? Probably not, but it encodes important information about migration, about the existence of better territory somewhere, and about the ancestors' ability to survive desperate circumstances. It reminds everyone that humans have faced catastrophes before and survived. It provides a cultural framework for understanding the current crisis. After the meal, there's music. Several group members have flutes made from bird bones, carefully carved with precise finger holes. The music isn't just entertainment, it's a form of group bonding that synchronizes emotions and reinforces social cohesion. Studies of modern humans show that making music together increases trust, cooperation, and group solidarity. Your ancestors discovered this 70,000 years ago. Some of the younger members of the group are working on craft work. One is making beads from shells, carefully drilling holes through them using a stone drill. Another is engraving patterns onto a piece of ochre, creating geometric designs that might have symbolic meaning or might just be aesthetically pleasing. This artistic activity seems frivolous when food is scarce and survival is uncertain, but it's not frivolous at all. It's what keeps you human. It's what maintains your sense of identity and meaning. It's what distinguishes you from the animals you hunt. You're not just trying to survive, you're trying to survive as humans with culture and meaning and beauty. As darkness falls, the fire is built up higher. The night is when predators are most active and the fire provides protection. The group arranges sleeping positions strategically. Children and elderly in the center, adults on the perimeter, weapons within easy reach. Someone will stay awake throughout the night, maintaining the fire and watching for danger. You fall asleep listening to the ocean waves, the crackling of the fire, and the quiet breathing of your group members. Tomorrow will bring the same challenges as today, finding enough food, avoiding predators, maintaining tools and equipment, caring for children and elderly, preserving knowledge and culture. But tomorrow might also bring something new. Maybe the scouts will find more animal tracks. Maybe the shellfish will be more abundant. Maybe the weather will be slightly warmer. Small improvements, incremental gains, tiny reasons for hope. This is how you survive a multi-generational crisis, not through dramatic heroism or individual brilliance, but through steady persistence, careful resource management, and unwavering commitment to group survival. Day after day, week after week, year after year, generation after generation, you keep going, and somehow, impossibly, it works. Your group survives. The children grow into adults and have children of their own. Knowledge is transmitted from old to young. Technologies are maintained and slowly improved. Social bonds are strengthened through shared hardship. You are one of the 2,000. You don't know that, of course. You don't have any concept of global human population. You don't know that similar small groups scattered across Africa are all that stand between humanity and extinction. You just know your own group, your own daily struggles, your own small corner of the world. But you and groups like yours across the continent are keeping humanity alive. Every child you raise, every skill you teach, every story you tell, every tool you make, all of this is preserving the human species during its darkest hour. You are the thread connecting humanity's past to its future. Without you, the chain breaks. Without you, humanity ends. That's what it meant to be one of the 2,000. Not to be a hero or a genius, just to be a normal human doing normal human things under abnormal circumstances, working hard, caring for your group, adapting to challenges, maintaining hope, and refusing to give up. This wasn't happening in just one location. Remember, genetic evidence suggests multiple refugia, multiple scattered populations surviving separately. Let's imagine another group, this one in East Africa, in what will someday be Ethiopia. Your group here is living at high elevation, around 2,500 meters above sea level. The altitude provides some protection from the climate chaos affecting lowland areas. Temperature extremes are moderated by elevation. Rainfall patterns are different from the lowlands. Highland ecosystems, while stressed, haven't completely collapsed the way lowland ones have. But highland living has its own challenges. The air is thinner, making physical exertion more difficult. Temperatures are colder, especially at night. The growing season for plants is shorter. Food diversity is lower than in lowland environments. Your group has adapted to highland life over many generations. You have physiological adaptations, larger lung capacity, more efficient oxygen processing in your blood, tolerance for cold. You also have cultural adaptations, specialized clothing for cold weather, knowledge of highland plant foods, hunting techniques for highland game species. The volcanic eruption affected this region differently than the coast. There was less direct ashfall, but the climate disruption was just as severe. The highland grasslands that supported large herbivores dried up. Many species migrated to lower elevations or went locally extinct. Your group's population crashed as food became scarce, but some resources remained. Highland streams fed by glacial melt continued to flow even when lowland rivers dried up. Certain hardy plant species adapted to high-altitude conditions survived. A few game species, particularly those adapted to cold and altitude, remained in reduced numbers. Your survival strategy is different from the coastal groups. You're not exploiting marine resources because you're hundreds of kilometers from any ocean. Instead, you've become specialists in exploiting marginal highland environments. You know every edible plant species in the region, including many that require special processing to remove toxins. You can track and hunt mountain nyala, ibex, and other highland species across incredibly difficult terrain. You've also developed sophisticated water management techniques, knowing the locations of every spring and seep in a vast highland territory, creating simple stone structures to collect and store water during the brief rainy seasons, understanding which streams are permanent and which are seasonal. Tool technology here has evolved slightly differently than at the coast. You use a lot of obsidian, volcanic glass that's abundant in this region and makes incredibly sharp tools. You've developed specialized hafting techniques for attaching obsidian blades to handles using plant resins combined with animal sinew. Your group's social structure is similar to the coastal groups, small extended families cooperating for survival, but there are some differences. Highland travel is more difficult, which makes maintaining contact with other groups harder. You might go an entire year without seeing anyone outside your immediate group of 30 to 40 individuals. This isolation increases inbreeding risk and makes genetic management more critical. Your group has cultural practices specifically designed to address this. When young people reach adolescence, small groups of them are sent on long journeys to find and make contact with neighboring groups. These journeys are dangerous, spanning weeks or months of travel through difficult terrain, but they're essential for exchanging marriage partners and maintaining genetic diversity. These adolescent journey groups also serve another function. They're how information spreads across the highland region. New tool techniques, knowledge about resource locations, warnings about dangerous areas, all of this information travels with these young ambassadors between groups. Your group's cultural life is rich despite the hardships. You have sophisticated oral traditions that encode practical knowledge in memorable story forms. The story of how a mythical ancestor discovered that a certain toxic plant becomes edible when properly processed. The story of how another ancestor survived a leopard attack by using fire as a weapon. The story of how the people learned to read animal behavior to predict weather. These aren't just entertaining tales, they're educational tools, mnemonic devices for preserving crucial survival information across generations in a culture without writing. A child who learns the stories also learns the practical knowledge embedded in them. You also have rich artistic traditions. The Highland Group specialises in creating portable art, small carved objects that can be easily carried during your semi-nomadic movements. Animal figurines carved from soft stone, geometric patterns engraved on pieces of ochre, beads made from drilled stones and seeds. These portable art objects serve multiple purposes. They're aesthetic expression, certainly, but they're also social currency used in trade and gift exchanges between groups. And they're identity markers, symbols of your particular cultural tradition that distinguish you from other human groups in the region. Music in your group is different from the coastal people's music. Instead of bone flutes, you use voice-based traditions, complex rhythmic chanting that can be performed without instruments. This makes sense for a highly mobile group where carrying extra equipment is a burden. Your voices are instruments enough. As days turn to weeks, weeks to months, months to years, your Highland group persists. Like the coastal group, you're hanging on through steady persistence rather than dramatic survival stories. Each day brings the same challenges: finding food, staying warm, avoiding predators, maintaining equipment, caring for the young and old, preserving knowledge, and somehow your group makes it through. The children survive to adulthood and have their own children. The knowledge is passed down, the technologies are maintained, the culture continues. Now let's imagine a third group, this one in West Africa, near what will someday be Cameroon. This group has a very different survival story because their refugium is a patch of rainforest that has managed to persist despite the climate crisis. Tropical rainforests are normally incredibly stable ecosystems, buffered against temperature extremes by dense vegetation and high humidity. But during the bottleneck period, most African rainforests dried out and died back to small remnant patches. Your group is living in one of these patches. A small area, maybe 50 kilometers across, where forest vegetation has managed to survive. This forest refugium is crowded, not just with humans, but with all the plant and animal species that depend on forest habitat. Everything that couldn't survive in the drying grasslands has retreated to this small patch, creating intense competition for resources. Your group survival strategy is based on intimate knowledge of forest ecology. You know the fruiting schedules of hundreds of tree species, understanding which trees produce fruit in which seasons and planning your movements around this knowledge. You know where certain animals nest, where they drink, where they travel. You understand the complex three-dimensional structure of the forest, knowing which levels of the canopy provide which resources. Unlike the coastal and highland groups, you spend significant time in trees, not living in them permanently, but climbing to gather fruits, nuts and honey to hunt arboreal mammals, to escape ground-level predators. This requires specialized skills and equipment, rope made from plant fibers, techniques for safe climbing, knowledge of which branches will support human weight. Your tools are adapted to forest life. smaller, lighter implements that can be carried while climbing, specialized tools for processing forest plants, some of which require extensive processing to remove toxins, blowguns for hunting small arboreal mammals, a technology unique to forest peoples. The forest refugium has provided relative abundance compared to what other groups are experiencing, but it's also created new dangers. The crowding of animal populations means predators are everywhere. Leopards that normally would have large territories are compressed into small areas, making them more aggressive and more likely to attack humans. Snakes that normally would be rare are common. Disease vectors like mosquitoes are concentrated. Your group has adapted by developing sophisticated predator avoidance strategies and medicinal knowledge. You know dozens of plant species with anti-malarial properties, antibacterial effects, or wound healing capabilities. This pharmacological knowledge, developed through trial and error over generations, is essential for surviving in the disease-rich forest environment. Socially, your group maintains connections with other human groups in the refugium. The forest is small enough that different groups regularly encounter each other. This has led to the development of complex social protocols for managing these encounters. Elaborate greeting rituals, gift exchange customs, conflict resolution procedures. These social technologies prevent the kind of violent confrontations that might occur when scarce resources create competition. It's in everyone's interest to maintain peaceful relations because conflict would weaken all groups, making everyone more vulnerable to predators and environmental pressures. Your group's cultural traditions are the most elaborate of the three we've followed. The relative abundance of the forest refugium provides more leisure time for cultural activities. You have more elaborate body decoration practices, more complex musical traditions, more developed storytelling customs, but you're also aware, in ways the coastal and highland groups aren't, that your situation is precarious. The forest refugium is shrinking. Year by year, the boundaries of the forest are contracting as drought kills trees at the edges. Species that were common are becoming rare. Water sources that were permanent are drying up. Your group discusses migration, whether to abandon the forest and try to reach the coast or the highlands where rumours suggest conditions might be better. But migration is incredibly risky. The journey would take months through hostile territory with no guaranteed resources, and you'd be moving from a familiar environment where you know every resource to unknown territories where your forest-specific knowledge might not apply. So you stay, you adapt to the slowly changing conditions, you shift your diet as some food sources disappear and others become more important, you modify your technologies to exploit new resources, you maintain your culture and your hope, and like the coastal and highland groups, you persist. The forest continues to shrink, but slowly enough that you can adapt. Your group's population remains stable, births roughly balancing deaths. Knowledge is transmitted across generations. The cultural traditions continue. 3 groups, 3 different refugia, 3 different survival strategies, but all facing the same fundamental challenge: how to keep humanity alive during the worst environmental crisis in our species' history. These 3 groups represent the diversity that allowed humanity to survive. If all humans had been coastal specialists and the ocean resources had failed, we would have gone extinct. If all humans had been highland specialists and the highlands had dried up, we would have gone extinct. If all humans had been rainforest specialists and the forests had completely collapsed, we would have gone extinct. But we weren't all the same. We were scattered across multiple environments, developing specialized adaptations to local conditions while maintaining the fundamental human capacities for flexibility and innovation. This diversity was our insurance policy. No single environmental disaster could wipe out all human populations because we weren't all in the same environmental basket. And critically, these groups weren't completely isolated. Through those dangerous long-distance journeys, through the maintenance of trading relationships, through the periodic movement of individuals between groups, genetic and cultural exchange continued even during the worst of the crisis. Highland obsidian shows up in coastal sites. Coastal shells show up in highland sites. Tool techniques spread across regions. This connectivity, maintained despite incredible difficulties, kept human populations genetically viable and culturally vibrant. It prevented the complete isolation that would have led to inbreeding depression and knowledge loss. It allowed innovations developed in one region to spread to others, benefiting all human populations. The bottleneck wasn't just about surviving. It was about surviving in a way that maintained diversity, connectivity, and the possibility of future recovery and expansion. And somehow, impossibly, those 2,000 individuals scattered across their refugia managed to do exactly that. Years turned into decades. Decades turned into centuries. Centuries turned into millennia. Conditions remained harsh, but slowly, imperceptibly, they began to improve. The volcanic aerosols cleared from the atmosphere. The sun shone brighter, temperatures rose slightly, rainfall patterns stabilized and improved. The refugia began to expand. Coastal groups found they could venture further inland as water sources revived. Highland groups discovered that lower elevations were becoming habitable again. Forest groups saw their refugium expand as rainfall increased and trees spread into formerly dry grasslands. And human populations began to grow, not rapidly at first, but steadily. Groups that had numbered 30 or 40 grew to 50 or 60. As food became more available, birth rates increased and childhood survival improved. Adult life expectancy lengthened slightly as the constant stress of near starvation eased. The expanding populations needed more territory. Groups began to fission, splitting into separate bands that could exploit different regions. These fission events were carefully managed to maintain social connections. The splitting groups weren't enemies. They were related bands that would continue to trade, exchange marriage partners, and share information. This fissioning and spreading created a network of related groups covering expanding territories. The coastal population spread along the coastline and began moving back into interior regions. The highland population expanded down into lower elevations. The forest population spread as the forests recovered and expanded, and these different populations began to reconnect. Groups that had been separated for thousands of years made contact again. Coastal specialists met highland specialists. Forest peoples encountered savanna peoples. The genetic and cultural mixing that resulted from these reunions increased diversity and evolutionary fitness. By 60,000 years ago, human populations across Africa were recovering, not back to pre-bottleneck levels yet, but growing steadily, and the humans emerging from the bottleneck were different from those who had gone in. They had been refined by natural selection, operating at maximum intensity. They carried the most successful technologies, the most effective social systems, the most adaptive behavioral traits. They were ready to expand, not just across Africa, but beyond it. The The stage was set for the great out-of-Africa migration that would see human populations spread across the entire planet. But before that global expansion, we need to understand one more crucial aspect of the bottleneck: its impact on human evolution itself. Because the bottleneck didn't just nearly end humanity, it fundamentally changed us in ways that still affect every human alive today. Natural selection during the bottleneck was intense. In larger populations, slightly harmful genetic variants can persist for many generations because they don't significantly reduce survival and reproduction. But in a population of 2,000, there's nowhere to hide. Every genetic variant that reduces fitness even slightly is strongly selected against. This means that harmful genetic variants were purged from the human gene pool during the bottleneck. Mutations that reduced intelligence, impaired social cooperation, weakened disease resistance, any genetic variant that made survival less likely was ruthlessly eliminated. But selection wasn't just negative, weeding out the bad. It was also positive, actively favoring certain traits. Cognitive flexibility, the ability to learn new skills quickly and adapt to changing conditions, was hugely advantageous during the bottleneck. Individuals who could think creatively, solve novel problems, and adjust their behavior based on experience were more likely to survive. Social intelligence was equally important. In small groups under extreme stress, the ability to cooperate effectively, resolve conflicts peacefully, and maintain group cohesion meant the difference between survival and extinction. Individuals with better social skills, more empathy, and stronger capacity for cooperation were favoured. Teaching ability also faced strong selection. Knowledge transmission was critical when small populations held all of humanity's accumulated wisdom. Individuals who were good at teaching, who could effectively pass knowledge to the next generation, were more valuable to group survival than those who weren't. Innovation capacity was another trait under selection. Groups that could develop new technologies, new subsistence strategies, new solutions to environmental challenges had better survival odds. The most innovative individuals, those who could look at old problems in new ways, were disproportionately likely to contribute genes to future generations. These selection pressures operated for thousands of years across dozens or hundreds of generations. That's long enough to cause measurable evolutionary change. The humans who emerged from the bottleneck weren't genetically identical to those who entered it. They had been refined, optimized for survival under the harshest possible conditions. This evolutionary refinement might explain why post-bottleneck humans were so successful. When they began expanding out of Africa around 60,000 years ago, they encountered Neanderthals in Europe and Denisovans in Asia, both of which were successful human species adapted to their own regions. Neanderthals were physically stronger than modern humans. They had larger brains on average. They'd been living in Europe for hundreds of thousands of years and were perfectly adapted to Ice Age conditions. By all rights, they should have been able to compete successfully with the modern humans entering their territories. But they didn't. Within a few thousand years of contact, Neanderthal populations began declining. By 40,000 years ago, they were gone except for small remnant populations. By 30,000 years ago, they were completely extinct as a distinct species. The same pattern played out with Denisovans in Asia. These mysterious hominins had been successful for hundreds of thousands of years. But when modern humans arrived, Denisovans began disappearing. They left genetic traces in modern human populations showing that interbreeding occurred, but they didn't survive as a distinct species. Why did modern humans outcompete these other human species? Not through violence necessarily, though there was probably some conflict, mainly through being slightly better at everything that mattered for survival in changing environments. Modern humans might have been better at social cooperation, able to coordinate larger groups for complex tasks. They might have been more innovative, developing new technologies more rapidly. They might have been more flexible, able to adjust their subsistence strategies as environments changed. They might have had better teaching systems, allowing knowledge to accumulate and spread more quickly. These advantages sound minor, but in evolutionary competition, small advantages compound over time. If modern humans could support slightly higher population densities, could recover from disasters slightly faster, could exploit resources slightly more efficiently, these small differences would add up over thousands of years. And modern humans had one more advantage. They had just survived the worst environmental crisis any human species had faced. They had been tested by nature at its harshest, and had proven their survival capacity. The Neanderthals and Denisovans were adapted to their specific regions. Modern humans were adapted to surviving anything. This might be the bottleneck's greatest legacy. Not just that we survived, but that surviving made us stronger. The intense selection pressure refined our species, selecting for exactly the traits that would make us successful as we expanded across the planet. Think about what this means for humanity today. Every human alive carries genes that were selected during the bottleneck for survival under extreme conditions. We are all, genetically speaking, descendants of the ultimate survivors. We inherit their cognitive flexibility, their social intelligence, their innovative capacity, their teaching abilities, their sheer determination to persist despite overwhelming odds. These traits aren't just historical curiosities, they're active parts of human nature that manifest every day. When humans face disasters, we often respond with remarkable creativity and cooperation. When confronted with new challenges, we often prove incredibly adaptable. When conditions seem hopeless, we often find ways to persevere. This resilience isn't learned or cultural, though culture enhances it. It's genetic, bred into us by natural selection operating during the bottleneck. We are, at a fundamental biological level, survivors. But the bottleneck's legacy is more complex than just breeding survivor traits into humanity. It also created vulnerabilities that we're still dealing with today. The loss of genetic diversity during the bottleneck made humans more susceptible to certain diseases. Many pathogens exploit genetic vulnerabilities in their hosts. In a species with high genetic diversity, any disease that depends on a specific genetic vulnerability will only affect individuals who carry that vulnerability. But in a species with low genetic diversity, like humans, a disease that can exploit a common genetic vulnerability can affect large portions of the population. This is why humans are so vulnerable to pandemic diseases. We're all so genetically similar that pathogens that evolve to exploit human hosts can often infect huge numbers of people. Other species with higher genetic diversity have more built-in resistance to pandemic diseases because their populations are more genetically heterogeneous. The bottleneck also created what geneticists call founder effects. Certain genetic variants that were rare in pre-bottleneck populations became common afterward, simply because they happened to be present in the survivors. These variants aren't necessarily beneficial or harmful, just random genetic quirks that increased in frequency by chance. Some human genetic disorders might be more common than they would be in a species with higher diversity because of these founder effects. Conditions that are caused by recessive genetic variants that happen to be present in bottleneck survivors might show up more frequently in modern populations than they would have in the larger, more diverse pre-bottleneck populations. The bottleneck also constrained future human evolution. With so little genetic diversity to work with, natural selection in modern humans has less raw material to act on. Beneficial mutations that arise now spread slowly through the large modern human population. In a species with more diversity, evolution might proceed faster because there's more variation for selection to work with. Some scientists worry that this genetic constraint might limit humanity's ability to adapt to future challenges. If we face new environmental pressures or new diseases, we might have less evolutionary capacity to respond than a species with higher genetic diversity would have. But these concerns need to be balanced against the reality that humans have been incredibly successful despite our low genetic diversity. We've colonized every terrestrial environment on Earth. We've built civilizations of unprecedented complexity. We've developed technologies that allow us to modify our environment rather than just adapting to it. Maybe the lesson is that genetic diversity is less important for humans than for other species because we can adapt culturally and technologically rather than relying solely on genetic evolution. The bottleneck might have reduced our genetic diversity, but it didn't reduce our capacity for innovation, learning, and cultural transmission. In fact, you could argue that the bottleneck enhanced these capacities by selecting for them so strongly. Modern humans might be less genetically diverse than we would be without the bottleneck, but we might also be smarter, more socially capable, and more adaptable than we would have been if the bottleneck hadn't refined us through intense natural selection. This brings us to a profound question that scientists and philosophers have debated. Was the bottleneck ultimately good or bad for humanity? Did it nearly destroy us, or did it make us what we are? The answer is probably both. The bottleneck was certainly terrible for the individuals who lived through it. Thousands of years of hardship, starvation, death, and loss. Countless individuals who didn't make it. Entire populations that went extinct. From the perspective of those who experienced it, the bottleneck was catastrophic. But from the perspective of humanity as a species, the bottleneck might have been transformative in positive ways. It refined us. It selected for our best traits. It proved our capacity for survival. It reduced our genetic load by eliminating harmful variants. It might have even accelerated our evolution by creating intense selection pressure. The bottleneck is like a crucible. The metal that goes in is impure, mixed with slag and impurities. The metal that comes out is refined, purified, strengthened. The process is harsh, involving extreme heat and pressure, but the result is a superior product. That's what the bottleneck did to humanity. It was harsh, probably the harshest test any human species has ever faced. But it produced modern humans, the most successful, adaptable, and innovative species in Earth's history. Whether you view this as good or bad probably depends on your perspective, but it's undeniably consequential. The bottleneck shaped who we are as a species in fundamental ways that still affect us today, 70,000 years later. As we wrap up this journey through humanity's near extinction, let's return to where we started, with you, waking up in the modern world, scrolling through your phone, living your ordinary life among 8 billion other humans. Now you know that this ordinary existence, this world full of people, this global civilization we take for granted, all of it exists because 2,000 individuals refused to give up 70,000 years ago. You exist because your ancestors survived the bottleneck. Think about that genealogy for a moment. Going back from you through your parents, grandparents, great-grandparents, you can probably trace your family tree back maybe 100 or 200 years with reasonable accuracy. Beyond that, the specific names and faces are lost to history. But go back far enough, back about 2,500 generations, and you reach individuals who lived during the bottleneck. You can't know their names, you can't know their faces, but they were real people with real lives who faced real challenges. Somewhere in your family tree is a person who lived on a harsh coast collecting shellfish and making art from ochre, or a person who lived in cold highlands hunting with obsidian-tipped spears, or a person who lived in a shrinking rainforest, learning the medicinal properties of hundreds of plants. That person survived. They had children who survived. Those children had children. Generation after generation, the chain continued unbroken from them to you. If that person had died before reproducing, if that chain had been broken anywhere along the line, you wouldn't exist. You owe your existence to their survival, and not just biological existence. You inherit their legacy in other ways too. The language you speak is made possible by neural structures that were refined during the bottleneck. The tools you use are distant descendants of technologies they invented. The social relationships you navigate use cognitive capacities they developed. The meaning and purpose you find in life draws on symbolic thinking abilities they perfected. You are, in the most profound sense, the heir to the bottleneck survivors. Their triumph is your foundation. Their persistence made your life possible. And here's the really amazing part. You're not just passively inheriting their legacy, you're actively extending it. Every time you solve a problem, you're using cognitive abilities refined during the bottleneck. Every time you cooperate with others, you're engaging in social behaviors that kept small groups alive during the crisis. Every time you teach something to a child, you're participating in the knowledge transmission system that preserved human culture through the worst times. The chain that connects you to the bottleneck survivors isn't broken. It continues through you to future generations. You are a living link between humanity's past and its future. This creates a kind of responsibility. Those 2,000 individuals fought so hard to survive, endured so much to keep humanity alive. They maintained their technologies, their social systems, their culture, their hope through thousands of years of crisis. They passed forward everything they had to subsequent generations. What are we doing with that inheritance? Are we living up to the example of the bottleneck survivors? Are we showing the same resilience, the same same innovation, the same commitment to passing a viable world forward to our descendants. These aren't just philosophical questions, they have practical implications for how we address modern challenges. Climate change, environmental degradation, resource depletion, social conflicts, pandemic diseases. We face serious challenges in the 21st century. But none of these challenges are as severe as what the bottleneck survivors faced. They dealt with global environmental collapse, population reduction to near extinction levels, and thousands of years of sustained crisis with nothing but stone tools, animal skins, and human intelligence. We have incomparably more resources. We have technology they couldn't imagine. We have accumulated knowledge from thousands of years of civilization. We have global communication systems, scientific understanding, industrial capacity. If they could survive with so little, surely we can address our challenges with so much. The bottleneck teaches us that humans are capable of extraordinary things when survival depends on it. We can adapt to almost any environment. We can innovate rapidly when necessary. We can cooperate on large scales when we need to. We can maintain hope and meaning even in the darkest circumstances. These capacities didn't disappear when the bottleneck ended. They're still part of human nature, still available when we need them. The question is whether we'll use them. The story of the bottleneck is ultimately a story about human potential, about what we're capable of when tested, about the resilience and adaptability that allowed our species to survive when survival seemed impossible. Every human alive today is proof that the impossible is possible. We exist because 2,000 individuals achieved something that should have been impossible. Surviving and thriving through a global environmental catastrophe that reduced humanity to the brink of extinction. We are all descendants of the impossible. We all carry in our genes and our culture the legacy of humanity's greatest triumph over adversity. We are all heirs to the 2,000 who saved our species. And now, with that knowledge, with that understanding of where we came from and what it took to get here, we face our own challenges. We write our own chapter in humanity's ongoing story. We decide what legacy to pass forward to future generations. The bottleneck survivors didn't know they were saving humanity. They were just trying to survive, to care for their families, to pass their knowledge forward. But their small, ordinary acts of survival and persistence, cumulative over thousands of years, kept humanity alive and set the stage for everything that followed. We have the same opportunity to meet our challenges with the same resilience, innovation, and determination. To maintain hope even when things seem difficult. To cooperate and support each other through hardship. To preserve and pass forward the best of human culture and knowledge. We don't need to be heroes. The bottleneck survivors weren't heroes in the dramatic sense. They were just humans doing human things under difficult circumstances. But those small, ordinary acts of survival added up to humanity's salvation. Our small, ordinary acts today add up too. How we treat each other, how we solve problems, how we respond to challenges, how we teach the next generation. All of this continues the human story that the bottleneck survivors fought so hard to preserve. So the next time you face a challenge, remember where you came from. Remember that your ancestors survived the worst environmental crisis in human history with nothing but stone tools and determination. Remember that you carry their genes, their legacy, their example. You are descended from survivors. You inherit their resilience. You possess their adaptability. You share their fundamental human capacities for innovation, cooperation, and persistence. The bottleneck nearly ended humanity. Instead, it proved what humanity is capable of. It demonstrated that we are survivors, that we can endure anything, that with intelligence and cooperation, no challenge is too great. That's the gift of the 2000 who saved our species. Not just biological existence, but the proof of human potential. The living demonstration that humans can survive and thrive through anything the world throws at us. 8 billion humans alive today. Every single one descended from those 2000 survivors, every single one carrying their genetic and cultural legacy, every single one proof that the impossible is possible. That's who we are, descendants of the ultimate survivors, heirs to humanity's greatest triumph, products of the bottleneck that tested our species to its absolute limits and found that we were strong enough, smart enough, and determined enough to pass the test. The story of how 2000 humans saved our species from extinction isn't ancient history. It's our story. It's where we came from. It's why we're here. It's who we are, and it's still being written